The modern world has been largely shaped by pivotal decisions made in the aftermath of World War II. Among them, the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949 stands as one of the most significant milestones. NATO's formation was a direct response to the growing threat of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe after the war. Events like the Czechoslovak coup and the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 raised alarm bells across Western Europe, prompting nations to seek solid security guarantees from the United States. NATO became more than just a military alliance. It symbolized unity among Western nations in facing the Soviet threat and protecting democratic values. But imagine a different scenario. What if NATO had never been established? What would have happened to Europe, the US, the Soviet Union, and the world? 1. Europe without a collective shield. After World War II, Europe was left in ruins, its economy devastated, its societies fractured. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had emerged as a military superpower, occupying much of Eastern Europe and aggressively expanding its influence. NATO's Article 5, which declares that an attack against one, an attack against all, became a vital safeguard for Western European nations. Without NATO, each European country would have had to fend for itself. Germany, France, and Italy, nations still reeling from war and civil strife, would have struggled to form effective self-defense forces. With over 200 Soviet divisions stationed in Eastern Europe by the early 1950s, the USSR could have easily threatened, coerced, or even invaded Western Europe under the banner of protecting the proletarian revolution. The result? The Iron Curtain might not have stopped at East Germany. It could have extended across France, Italy, and even Spain, effectively turning the entire European continent into a Soviet sphere of influence. 2. US pulls back. Isolationism resurfaces. The establishment of NATO marked the end of America's post-World War I isolationist policy. Without NATO, the US might have reverted to this stance, focusing on domestic development while gradually reducing its military presence in Europe. In that case, who would protect the West? Without NATO, the US would have had little justification for stationing hundreds of thousands of troops in Europe throughout the Cold War. This would have left Europe more vulnerable to Soviet pressure. And without a unified Western strategy, Moscow could have expanded its reach unchecked. 3. Fragmented Europe. Smaller security pacts. Had NATO never existed, alternative security arrangements might have formed, such as a defense pact between France, Britain, and the Benelux countries, as initiated by the 1948 Brussels Treaty. However, these alliances would lack US military might and the nuclear umbrella, greatly weakening their deterrence. Major powers like France, Britain, or West Germany might have felt the need to build independent military strength. To secure themselves, countries like France and Britain could have accelerated their nuclear weapons programs and maintained larger standing armies. West Germany, too, would have faced pressure to rapidly rearm on a massive scale, a prospect likely to provoke regional unease, even among its Western neighbors. Instead of a unified NATO, Europe could have splintered into multiple, smaller alliances, prone to internal disagreements similar to the pre-World War I era. Washington might have had to sign bilateral defense treaties with key European states like the UK, France, and West Germany. This would have created a much more complex and less effective security structure, with uneven levels of US commitment. 4. Higher risk of proxy wars or direct conflict. One of NATO's greatest achievements was preventing direct war between the great powers. Without NATO, the likelihood of hot wars between the US and the USSR would have risen dramatically. Consider these flashpoints. Berlin Crisis 1948 to 1961. Without NATO backing, the Soviets might have taken all of Berlin. Korean War, without NATO, European support for the anti-North Korea coalition might have been minimal, emboldening the USSR to intervene more directly. Turkey, Greece crisis. Both countries once teetered on the edge of communist takeovers. Without NATO, civil wars or Soviet-backed coups could have turned them into satellite states. 5. A stronger Soviet Union, a different Cold War outcome. NATO drew a clear red line in Europe, forcing the Soviet Union to maintain millions of troops and a massive defense budget to counterbalance the West. This was a major factor in the USSR's economic exhaustion and eventual collapse in 1991. It also helped deter a direct Soviet invasion. Without NATO, the dynamics of the Cold War might have shifted dramatically. Increased risk of miscalculation. A fragmented European security landscape could have encouraged Soviet adventurism, testing the resolve of individual nations rather than facing a united bloc. The risk of miscalculations leading to armed conflict would have been much higher. US containment would look different. Even without NATO, the US would likely have pursued a policy of containing communism. But this effort would have been more complicated, requiring large, permanent military deployments across Europe through bilateral agreements, which could provoke internal political disputes in both America and host nations. Without NATO, Moscow would have had fewer constraints and more freedom to dominate Eastern and Central Europe. And if the Cold War still occurred, the outcome might have been very different, perhaps a weakened West instead of a collapsed USSR. 6. Long-term consequences for global order. NATO's security umbrella created a stable environment that allowed Western European nations to focus on economic and political cooperation, eventually leading to the formation of the European Economic Community (EEC), the precursor to today's European Union (EU). Without NATO, the post-war world would have lacked a Western-led order. Core principles like democracy, individual liberty, open markets, and human rights might never have spread as far as they did. Slower European integration. Without the security provided by the US, European nations might have prioritized military spending over economic cooperation. Mutual distrust and competition could have obstructed the deep collaboration needed to build a common market. A larger role for neutral and non-aligned states. Countries like Yugoslavia, under Tito's leadership, pursued a non-aligned path. In a Europe without rigid military blocs, the non-aligned movement could have grown stronger, attracting more nations seeking to avoid entanglement in the superpower rivalry. 7. No NATO. No humanitarian interventions. In many post-Cold War conflicts, NATO played a central role. Kosovo, 1999. NATO intervened to stop genocide. Afghanistan, 2001. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in response to terrorism. Libya, 2011. NATO helped protect civilians from Gaddafi's regime. Without NATO, these interventions might have lacked legitimacy and effectiveness, creating power vacuums where extremist or authoritarian regimes could rise. Conclusion: a more divided, dangerous world. If NATO had never been formed, the post-World War II world might have descended into a more fragmented, volatile, and dangerous era. The Soviet Union might have expanded unchecked. Europe would likely have remained weak and divided. The US might have withdrawn from its global responsibilities, and localized Cold Wars could have easily turned into full-scale, hot wars, not just once, but repeatedly. NATO is more than a military alliance. It represents Western unity, a strategy for crisis prevention, and a rules-based international order. Without it, the world we know today, relatively stable despite ongoing challenges, might never have existed. Instead, we might be living in a world of division, confrontation, and chaos.